a younger contemporary of Hugo van der Goes named Gerard David. And this nativity is shown with two donor portraits. So they paid to have this triptych, this three-part picture painted. Very typical nativity scene. You can immediately see that something different is going on in Hugo van der Goes's painting. And you can see this even better if you compare this late nativity to an earlier nativity scene by Hugo van der Goes. This was painted for a very eminent Florentine banker who was based in Bruges. This is in present-day Belgium. This is where Hugo van der Goes was working. Well, what is distinctive about van der Goes's version of the Nativity? First of all, we see two large figures, and these figures are positioned as if partly in our space. And this is why they're truncated. And moreover, they're moving a curtain, and the curtain is semi-transparent. It partly blocks the view, but if you look carefully, you can see that the fabric is not quite opaque. You can see through it. You can see what's on the other side of it, and they're pulling this curtain open. And moreover, the curtain is hanging from a rod, and the rod is executed in a kind of plaster called gesso. And so the rod projects from the surface of the image, and what Hugo van der Goes has done is to make it look as if the rod is in front of the painting, not in the painting. And these two figures, who stand as if in the viewer's space, have pulled open the semi-transparent curtains to reveal the nativity scene. Perhaps you can see that the way the two figures and the curtains are painted is rather different from the way the nativity scene is painted. The two figures have a lot of volume, they have a lot of texture, and there is a much stronger system of lights and darks articulating them. The nativity scene behind them is painted much more flatly. There's much less texture, and there's much less tonal differentiation. So it's as if there's one pictorial mode operative in the foreground and a very different pictorial mode operative in the background. And how do we explain this? Well, one of the places we can go to understand what's going on in this picture are these two texts, which are representative of the kinds of devotional literature circulating within religious communities that followed the devotional practices that came to be known as the modern devotion. And basically, the modern devotion was an attempt to make monastic culture available to the laity, available to relatively well-educated members of the non-clerical community. It gets going intensively in the Low Countries and the Rhineland in the 14th century, and Hugo van der Goes in the 15th century was an adherent to the modern devotion. Indeed, when he painted this picture, he was the member of a community of monastic brothers and lay brothers, and this was called the Red Cloister. The Red Cloister, and he was living at the Red Cloister, a member of this community. Two of the texts that were most favored in this community, and they're both texts about the nature of prayer, how one prays. They're texts about meditative prayer, are Geert Grote's On the Four Kinds of Meditation and Jan Mombaer's Rosettum. And that's Latin for, you could translate that rosary, as if, visualize to yourself a chain of roses. Each rose is a prayer, and he sets forth this sequence of prayers. Both Grote and Mombaer tell us that for us as human beings, prayer must begin with material images. Images that have substance and weight. Images that are based in the things we see in nature. But the function of these images is to seize our attention. And we use these images as a platform on the basis of which we then visualize more spiritual images, images that are not so much material images, but abstracted images that are truer to the nature of God, for prayer is directed toward God, and the function of prayer is to bring us closer to God. So you start with material images, and then you move from that register of image to a more spiritual, a more abstracted form of image. And both Gert Groote and Jan Mombar compare these two registers of prayerful image to the distinction between the kind of images used by the prophets in the Old Testament. For those of you who know the Bible is divided into two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in a Christian reading of the Bible, the Old Testament functions as a prefiguration of the New Testament. So one of the ways in which you read the Old Testament is as an adumbration, is as a series of references to the coming of Christ, God and man, in the New Testament. And what Groote and Mombar argue is that prophecies of the Old Testament are like material images. And these material images prepare us for the less mediated presence, which is an intensely spiritual presence of God in Christ in the New Testament. And Groote says specifically that the prophets Isaiah and Habakkuk, who are the great prophets of the coming of Christ, of what theologians call the mystery of the incarnation, the becoming man of God in and through Christ. The two great prophets of this mystery, of the Nativity, are Isaiah and Habakkuk. Isaiah and Habakkuk. And it is very likely that these are the two figures mediating between us and the Nativity, and they are present to us as material images. They have weight, they have substance, they have textural differentiation. We can compare them to the things of nature we know at first hand through our corporeal senses. But as they open the curtains of prophecy, they reveal a more spiritualized register of presence. Christ, who is present to us, but in a more spiritual, a more abstracted way. He's present to us, he's looking directly into our eyes, but without that texture, without all of those vestiges of the material image. Now, what about the two curtains? Well, Mombar and Groote compare the material image and prophetic imagery, which is analogized to material images, to what they call velamina, which is a Latin term for veils, And what they say is that these images, these prophecies, are like veils that are neither opaque nor entirely transparent. They allow us to glimpse spiritual truths, to discern them, but not clearly to see them. The two prophets are opening these velamina. They are opening these semi-transparent veils and allowing us to negotiate from the register of the material image to the register of the spiritual image. Now, there's one other thing going on in this picture. Christ is holding a branch of something, some sort of species of plant, and it's the same plant you see growing over here. And in fact, all of these plants were part of the pharmacopoeia of the monks of the Red Cloister. This plant is, and I brought this for you, this plant is black nightshade, and then the next plant is speedwell, and then the next plant is herb Robert, and then you have redleg, and then you have plantain. Plantain and redleg are used to staunch blood, and they are an allusion to the ultimate sacrifice of Christ, and Christ ultimately dies to redeem humankind, and so this is already an allusion to the sacrifice of Christ. Black nightshade and herb Robert, and Christ is holding a sprig of black nightshade, are a medicament against melancholy. Grote and Mombar both argue that Christ came to save us from the melancholy condition of sin. And they compare sin to melancholy. And they argue that Christ came to make us happy once again by making it possible for us to unite with God. He came to save us from sin. Christ is holding black nightshade to refer to his coming as a medicament that saves us from melancholy, the melancholy of sin. And finally, what about the speedwell? Speedwell was used against eye disease. It was used to clarify vision. And of course, that's very relevant here, because in opening the curtains, the two prophets are revealing to us a spiritual image of Christ and therefore clarifying our spiritual vision. So, a very surprising nativity image, a masterpiece, a meesterstuk to use the Dutch, in the sense that it presents a conventional subject in a way that tests our powers of discernment, both visual and interpretative. So let's look at a second image. Let's now move to the early 16th century and look at one of the strangest pictures ever painted, and also one of the most elaborate. It takes days to look at this picture closely, and we have about 15 minutes. So let's see what we can do. This is really going to test our cognitive faculty. It's Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. You can see from the dimensions that it's very big. The figures are very small, and there are hundreds of them, but the picture is big. And the last picture I showed you, the Hugo van der Goes, is about half-life size. So that actually is a relatively big picture as well. We know now for whom this was painted. And it's only recently that scholars have been able to figure this out. It was commissioned by Engelbert II of Nassau, who was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the Low Countries, but did not have a son. And so he made Henry of Nassau, Billing and Dietz, who ultimately, when he acceded to the estates of Engelbert, became Henry III. He made him his heir. And he commissioned this painting, collaborating with the humanist courtier Joris van Harleveen, as a princely mirror for his heir apparent, Henry. A princely mirror is a device that is used to present moral issues to the person who studies it. And this is what the picture is doing. It is educating, what was intended to educate Henry. And what it was intended to educate him to think about is what I'm going to be talking with you for the next, that's what I'm going to be talking about for the next 15 or so minutes. Now, at the court of Burgundy, which is the court that controls the Low Countries, at the court of Burgundy, and Henry was one of the highest noblemen at the court, as were Philip the Fair, Charles de Croix, Joris van Harleveen. Works like this, princely mirrors, were studied in a corporate fashion. So it is very unlikely that Henry would have stood in front of this picture by himself and meditated on it. It is more likely that he was standing in front of it with Philip the Fair, Charles de Croix, Joris van Harleveen, other members of this high aristocratic circle, and talking about it, discussing it, figuring it out. The painting consists of two parts. There is an exterior and then the interior. So this is what we see on the exterior. The exterior is monochrome. The interior is highly polychrome. The exterior depicts the world as it's described in Psalms 32 and also Psalm 148, but primarily Psalm 32. And Psalm 32, which is a psalm of praise to the Lord, describes how, in his majesty and power, the Lord gathers all of the waters of the world as if in a crystalline vessel. And that is what Bosch depicts on the interior. The waters of the world gathered in a vessel as an index of the power of God. And he quotes from Psalm 32 at the top of the image. He spoke and it was done. He commanded and they were created. He spoke and it was done. That is, God spoke and it was done. God commanded and they were created. But Bosch has also shown storm clouds at the top of the image. And this has to do with the way the first day of creation was interpreted by theologians associated with the court of Burgundy, and in particular the way it is interpreted by Augustine, who is one of the greatest of the church fathers. So one of the greatest interpreters of Christian doctrine and of Christian scripture. And what Augustine and what Burgundian theologians on the basis of Augustine argued is that on the first day of creation, when God separated darkness from light, he was separating the good angels from the bad angels. The good angels from the bad angels. This is going to prove very significant for our reading of the triptych, which is the term for a picture that has doors that can open and close. And so the way Bosch's triptych works is that when you close the doors, you see that monochrome image. And when you open the doors, you see the polychrome image on the inside. So the first of the three polychrome images you see when the triptych opens is this one. And in Bosch's account of the creation of the world, as we can see from a number of other images that Bosch creates, and this is true also here, and I'll explain how in just a moment, we see angels falling from heaven and contaminating the world. And you see how the angels are falling from heaven, so the good angels are driving the bad angels from heaven and contaminating the world. And in picture after picture by Bosch that depicts the creation, he shows this, that already after the first day of creation, bad angels ejected from heaven were beginning to contaminate the rest of creation. So as God then on the second day and the third day and the fourth day creates and creates and creates, he creates the animals, he creates the creatures of the air and the sea, and ultimately he creates the first man and then the first woman, Adam and Eve. The angels already there contaminating it all. Well, he doesn't show the angels falling from heaven in the Garden of Earthly Delights triptych, but he implies that they are there. How does he do this? He does this by basing the interior of the triptych on these crucial passages from Augustine. First of all, from Augustine's City of God, the notion that the world created by God is ordered according to species, species, which refers to spiritual form as the determinant of material form. According to ordo, which is systemic order, the relation of every part of the world to every other part of the world. And this relation is proportional. And according to modus, which is the internal organization, the internal decorum of each created thing. So the world is created according to species, ordo, and modus. Species, order, and mode. In one of his most important exegetical works, works that systematically interpret Scripture, Augustine argues the world is also organized according to measure, number, and weight. And he interprets measure as the limit, the demarcation of things, for no thing has an indefinite range of possibilities. it is demarcated. And then he interprets number as proportional harmony that confers stability and equilibrium on all things. And then he interprets weight as that which inclines things towards their appropriate functions. And so, for Augustine, the world created by God and construed by God as good is a world in which measure, number, and weight, and species, order, and mode govern all things. And this is precisely what is not happening when you enter the triptych. Now, what is happening in the left-hand scene? We seem to be seeing a creation scene. We seem to be seeing God creating Eve from the rib bone of Adam. For that is what Genesis tells us was the origin of Eve. And this is the way it's usually depicted. Can you see that at the background over there? That is usually how this scene is depicted. So this is that other triptych by Bosch that I'm just bringing in as a comparandum. And this doesn't seem to be quite what's going on here. And in fact, what's going on here is very complicated. God has created Eve and then is holding her and supporting her in an action of spiritual marriage. He is in effect joining himself to Eve. It's a kind of imagery of marriage, an imagery of joining, because Eve stands for the church. She stands not only for humankind, but also for the church, and God marries himself to humankind through the institution of the church. That is what Bosch is implying by this very strange interaction of God and Eve. And the position of Adam is also very surprising. And you'll notice that Adam's legs are extended and then they're crossed, the feet are crossed. And Bosch is alluding to this. This is the sacrifice of Christ, who is being nailed to a cross. Remember, I said that Christ, in Christian theology, dies to redeem humankind of sin. He's ultimately crucified. And Adam's pose alludes to the future suffering of Christ because Christian theologians, including Augustine, interpret Adam as the first man and Christ as the new Adam who comes to save humankind from the sin committed by the first man, Adam himself, and he does this through his sacrifice on the cross. And so in Bosch's picture, Adam alludes to the redemptive sacrifice of Christ, and Eve alludes to the marriage of humankind to God through the institution of the church. God, the Creator, if you look at the face of God, for those of you who know your Christian imagery, is the face of Christ. So this is another surprise. God is here depicted as Christ, and Bosch does this to emphasize that the marriage of Christ and the church is the basis for human redemption, and that it is through the redemptive sacrifice of Christ, to which the pose of Adam can be analogized, that humankind is redeemed. Okay, it's very important that he incorporates this into the left-hand panel, which is about the creation of the world, because the left-hand panel also includes many elements that show that the world is contaminated. The world is already fallen in the sense of sinful. And we can see this in many places. We can see creatures emerging from the water that are not identifiable according to measure, order, weight, species, or form. Indeed, many of these creatures are so strange we have no names for them. The three two-headed lizard-like creature, the creature that's part lizard and part crustacean. These are very, very strange creatures. And moreover, even at this early moment in the cycle of human history, creatures are preying on each other. They're already starting to eat each other. So something is already wrong here. And something is also wrong in the middle ground. We see a big fountain. And the fountain is colored. The color of the fountain is the same as the colors of God Christ. And this is so that we think about them in relation to each other. And the fountain is one of the most standard metaphors for Christ. Christ redeems humankind from sin, and therefore Christ is the fountain of life. This is one of the most standard metaphors for Christ. But this fountain can't be analogized to Christ. It's all wrong. Something is wrong here. At the heart of the fountain is an owl, a creature of the night, a creature often associated with, on the one hand, cunning, and on the one hand, ignorance. And the fountain, if you look closely at its elements, is somewhat geological and somewhat vegetal and somewhat animal. So again, we've transgressed the borders of measure, weight, species, form, order, etc., etc. The fountain, in fact, is an allusion to the tree of virtues or the tree of vices. It's also an allusion to this object. It stands for imperium, control over the world, and this is an image of Christ as Savior of the world, holding the orb topped by a cross, and this is the basis for the shape of this strange fountain. So the fountain clearly stands for the world. The presence of the owl suggests that the world is fallen. The allusion to the tree of virtues in a form that doesn't have, in Augustine's sense, species, order, weight, measure, etc., also insists that this is an image of the fallen world. And finally, the center of the fountain looks a bit like an eyeball, doesn't it? And what I'm showing you above is a very famous painting by Hieronymus. It was very famous in the 16th century by Hieronymus Bosch of the 7 deadly sins. And at the heart of the 7 deadly sins, he depicts the eye of God. And at the heart of the eye of God, in the pupil, is the image of Christ. And here, in this eye-like form, he incorporates an owl rather than Christ. So something is wrong. So let's look briefly at the center, just a few elements from the center panel, because so much is going on in the center panel. In the middle ground of the center panel, you have a procession of figures that are encircling various women who are bathing in a pool. And these figures are male performing for the women, trying to attract them so that the women choose them. And these various figures, and if you look at them, you'll see they're very, very strange. I mean, look at those figures. I mean, some are part human. They're riding strange beasts. Many of the beasts are chimerical. They're one beast, and then they become another beast. And they're based on margins of manuscript illumination in which we see an inversion of what we generally find at the center of the manuscript page. So at the center of the manuscript page, you'll often find a religious scene, or in secular manuscripts, a very decorous scene. And then the margins are where you put the very indecorous images. And then people would think about the relation between the decorous and the indecorous. What Bosch has done is to take what inhabits the margins, and marginal imagery can be very sexualized and very ironic. And it can often be, so to speak, topsy-turvy. It can turn your expectations of decorous behavior on their head. And what Bosch does is to take what's going on in the margins and to put them in the center of the image to show that something very strange is going on here. This is just another marginal illustration. Now, if we look closely at some of what, so this is the fountain in the background. we see that the structures in the garden, which is a kind of paradise garden, so this is an allusion to the fountains. So this is not paradise, but it alludes to it. And we see that these structures are even more geological and vegetal and animal. So they're even more chimerical than in the panel on the left. And we see many figures standing on their heads, because this is a topsy-turvy world in which there is no longer a clear distinction between good behavior and bad behavior. So what's some of the behavior we're looking at? Well, first of all, most of the behavior is based on courtly love imagery, so courtly garden of love imagery. But whereas garden of love imagery is very amorous, but ultimately turns on the trope of restraint, so that you see that which you desire, you articulate your desire, but you don't consummate it. You endlessly forestall to consummate it. The imagery that Bosch shows us is an inversion of this, in that we see everyone doing nothing but consummating sexual desire. And we can see this if we look more closely at some of what's going on. You can see, for example, here, various figures in a love garden, but of course they're all nude. This is not something you see in courtly love imagery. And here's a beautiful manuscript page from one of the most famous courtly romances, the Roman de la Rose. And you can see that what is going on in Bosch's painting alludes to this kind of setting and this kind of behavior, but pushes beyond the limits of the acceptable, pushes beyond the limits of decorum. And Bosch, for example, here, implies that these figures are all body and no reason. Where you would expect to see their head, you see an owl. And then you see figures kissing each other, and one of the most conventional metaphors in courtly love poetry is that love is the fruit that we most desire to consume, and yet it's withheld from us. And what Bosch shows us is fruit being consumed everywhere. In fact, the fruit is huge, and generally the fruit is super ripe. But then he also shows that the fruit is punctured by thorns. So he wants to imply to you that all of this activity that consummates desire will actually have thorny consequences. And here you see three men who are like knights competing for the favor of a lady, and what they want is they want to seize the symbol of that lady's favor, which would be a flower. But very cleverly, Bosch turns the flower into a thorny thistle, as if to say they want to seize love, and indeed carnal love, and they will suffer the consequences for doing that. And ultimately, this is where you end up. The courtly imagery that we see distorted in the center panel is now even more distorted in the panel on the right, which alludes to the torments of hell, and also incorporates the figures that are most transgressive of Augustine's criteria for order in the created world. And we see this in the tree man, who is part goose, part plucked goose, part goose egg, part tree, part human. It's a very strange figure indeed. And throughout, we see references to courtly instruments of lovemaking that refer back to the psalm on the exterior of the altarpiece. Because what psalm says is, "Come, let us praise the Lord. Let us praise him with the 10-stringed psaltery, with the harp," and so on and so forth. And here you see these devices converted into instruments of torment. The function of the triptych is to make its viewers, the Burgundian nobles who are viewing this triptych, think about the issue of what orders the world according to the will of God and the way in which that order is transgressed. There are all sorts of other ways to talk about this picture. I don't think picture people looked at this picture and simply thought how evil and horrible we were. There's also a very comic, parodic dimension to the picture, and this has to do with the way in which you learn at court by playing games. If you want to talk with me about that at dinner, I would be most happy to do that. But obviously we won't be eating the way these people are eating. Okay, and finally, I wanted to show you one of the most famous paintings produced in the Low Countries in the 17th century, Rembrandt's Night Watch. It was almost immediately after it was painted, celebrated as one of the greatest group portraits ever produced. But it's more than a group portrait, as you'll see in a moment. Like Bosch's painting, like Hugo van der Goes's painting, it moves beyond the expectations of the group portrait. It was painted for the meeting hall of the Clovers, and the Clovers are musketmen. They were the musketeers of Amsterdam. Clover means musket, but Clover is very similar to the Dutch word klauw, and so the symbol of this civic militia company of musketmen was the chicken foot. And this girl, beautifully dressed in satin, who is running towards the right, has a chicken attached to her belt with its claws turned up, because this is the punning name of the company. They were the Cloveneers, the musketeers, the, so to speak, claw-footed men. We can identify the figures in this picture. The captain of the company is Frans Banning-Kok. His lieutenant was Willem van Ruitenburg. Just to identify a few other figures, this is one of the sergeants, Reyer Engelen. This is another sergeant, Rombout Kemp. And this is one of the company men. His name was Wormskirk. This is the ensign carrier of the company. His name was Visser. So we know who the men in this picture were. There were 20 precincts of civic militia companies in Amsterdam. You had to be relatively wealthy to be a member of one of these companies. For one thing, weaponry was very expensive in the 17th century. And to attain higher political office in Amsterdam, you had to be a member of one of these companies. So these companies were important not only for elite sociability in Amsterdam, but for anyone who aspired to high political office. And these were all members of the merchant class. They were the investment bankers of their day, and they were members of extremely important Dutch Reformed families. So they were members of the state religion, to the extent that there's a state religion. That's complicated in the northern Netherlands, but they were members of the Dutch Reformed Church. Now, the painting hung in one of the most important big halls in Amsterdam. It was one of the biggest spaces in the city. So this is the new meeting hall of the musketmen. Rembrandt's Night Watch hung here next to 6 other group portraits. And I'm just going to show you what the interior of the room looked like. So you're looking here at the governors. So these are the governors of the civic militia companies. And so each of the civic militia companies in this precinct met in this hall. Just to show you what the other ones look like, I'm going to go through them very, very briefly, but look at them closely, and you'll see they're very similar to each other. So this is Sandraarts of the company of Cornelis Bicker, Albert Bass's company, Jan van Vloswijk's company, Cornelis de Graaf. He was the wealthiest man in the Netherlands. He was one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Cornelis de Graaf's company, Bartholomeus van der Helst's company, Roelof Bicker's company, and then we're back to Rembrandt. And something you should keep in mind is that in all of these other portraits, the captain of the company is generally seated at the right or at the left. So in this one, this is the captain. Here is the ensign, and then you have the various other figures. You can always tell the lieutenant because he holds a weapon called the partisan. Rembrandt's group portrait is different. And it's different in a number of ways. First of all, there is an action taking place. Whereas in the other group portraits, the men are either showing their arms or gathered in an expression of sociability around a table or a piece of sculpture, some object that was important to the company. In Rembrandt's picture, something is happening. The men are collecting to march out of the picture. This is the only image that is organized around an activity. And moreover, the captain and the lieutenant have been moved from the margins of the image to the front, the center, and the foreground, as if they are moving forward and bringing their men with them. So the men are conforming to their action, imitating that action in obedience to their command. The hierarchical organization of the picture and this kind of hierarchical organization and its coherent action distinguish this group portrait from all of the other portraits in the room. And also distinguishing it is the presence of the emblem carrier of the company. Emblem carriers, people who marched with the company with their device, here the claw foot, were a thing of the 16th and early 17th centuries, but by this time they were very archaic indeed. But the picture, it turns out, is filled with archaic elements. And we can see this if we look at the sergeant standing on the left side. This is not a helmet you wore in 1642, and nor is the doublet contemporary, and nor is the weaponry contemporary. And so what Rembrandt is doing is he's mixing the old and the new. He's referring to the past of the Civic Militia Company. They were very, very important to the rise of a Dutch reformed ruling class in the 16th century. But by 1642, they had largely lost this military function. But Rembrandt recuperates that military function by showing elements of 16th century martial dress, and moreover, showing these men actually using their weapon. Not just displaying it, but actually using it. And so the figure in red at left is loading the musket, and then this figure, again in archaic dress, he's wearing turn of the 17th century military kit, is firing the musket. Can you see this over here? Here's the tip of the musket, and it's just firing. And this man is startled by the sound of the explosion, whereas, of course, Banningcock, who's the captain of the company, doesn't flinch at all. He's a person who's perfectly composed. He's there to lead. And then this man is blowing into the powder pan to clean it so that it can be loaded again. So Rembrandt is very keen to show this weapon in use. He's keen to show us archaic elements that refer to the past of the company, and he's keen to gather this company into a single action of falling into marching order in obedience to the command of their leader. What is this all about? And here you see the drummer. So they are falling into marching order to the sound of a drum. It's a very noisy picture when you look at it closely. Oh, and the other thing is it was recently cleaned. And when they cleaned it, they discovered that Rembrandt had painted puffs of smoke that drift between the men as they march forward. So it's a brilliantly painted picture. What's Rembrandt up to here? Two things. Number one, Frans Banningcock was an historian. He was a historian of the civic militia companies. And he wrote histories of the militia companies to protect their traditional rights and privileges. So he wanted an historical, not simply contemporary, but also historical account of his civic militia company, and he wanted to show that the past of the company was still relevant to its present. He wanted to insist on the military functions of the company. It should not simply be honorific, it should remain an important political and military instrument in Amsterdam. The second thing Rembrandt wanted to do, and his contemporaries immediately understood this about his painting, is he wanted to reconcile portrait painting, which is a very descriptive kind of painting, with narrative history painting. Narrative history painting on the order of this great picture about war by Rubens, The Horrors of War. It's an allegory, but it's organized around an action, the action of the separation of the god of war, Mars, from Venus, who here is the person who pacifies Mars but loses grip of him, hence the allegory of war. At the same time that Rembrandt was painting The Night Watch, he produced this very famous print of the Triumph of Mordecai. Rembrandt was very fascinated with Jewish subjects. He had many Jewish friends. And Mordecai, the leader of his people, is here being celebrated for saving them from a terrible massacre. And if you look at the background of this scene and you look at the way the figures are organized, you see that Rembrandt based his picture on this historical subject. Now, Rembrandt is claiming in this picture that group portrait painting has a status akin to that of the highest kind of pictorial art, which is narrative history painting. He's producing a new kind of history picture, which is also a group portrait, and transforming the group portrait by showing that it can function as a history picture. His picture is a Meisterstück in the sense that it pushes against the expectations of portrait painting and history painting, reconciling them, and thus producing a new kind of pictorial image. Or, to put it simply, a new form of Meisterstück, masterpiece. Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to take questions.